As long as I've been a movie nerd, I've also been a nerd about the Oscars. I know it's not the definitive metric on what makes a movie good, but it is cool to see films you like get recognized by the industry. That's especially the case for the films nominated for Best Picture. They are the 10 films picked out by the Academy that will represent that year in film. But it wasn't always 10. It was 5 films for over 60 years before the Academy changed it to 10 in 2009. Now, the reason they gave was so they could showcase a wider variety of films that would not otherwise be recognized. But we all know it's because of the flack they caught for not nominating The Dark Knight in 2008. So, the 10 nominated in 2009 included films like Up and District 9, an animated film and a sci-fi film that definitely wouldn't have made a group of 5. But in 2011, the Academy changed up the category again, so that the Best Picture category would be between 5 and 10 films, not just 10, based on a threshold that each film would have to reach during the nomination process. From then on until 2021, when the Academy changed it back to 10 films, there were either 8 or 9 films recognized for Best Picture in every year. And every year, it bothered me, because I wanted to know what movies were getting left off that list. So today, I want to go through those years and hypothesize what those movies that were left off might be, based on their performance in other categories of the Oscars, momentum during the award season, and my best estimates on how everything might have played out. This is how it's going to work. For each year, I'm going to highlight a few films that I think had a shot at a Best Picture nomination, but were left out. I'll go through the case for and against each film being nominated, and I'll give you my pick of who I think would have made the cut in a field of 10. For 2011, the 5 films I want to talk about here are The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Ides of March, Bridesmaids, Drive, and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Starting with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, this is a film that arguably had the most precursors on their side, getting nominations from the PGA, the Producers Guild of America, and David Fincher scoring a Directors Guild of America nomination. The film also scored 5 Oscar nominations, including Best Actress for Rooney Mara, Cinematography, both sound categories, and Film Editing. Speaking of film editing, it actually won Film Editing, a very rare case where the film that wins Film Editing wasn't even nominated for Best Picture. It was also the film that arguably had the best chance of getting nominated, according to film critics, that didn't actually get nominated. In support of all those other things the film had going for it, the buzz that David Fincher had coming off of The Social Network also had to help him. If there is a case against this film, I would probably say that it's too much of a, quote, genre film, not much of a, quote, Oscar film, which is seemingly what the expansion of the Best Picture category was supposed to rectify, putting films outside of the typical Oscar fare into the Best Picture race. Also, something that would be considered against it is, while it was a success at the box office, it did fall below many expectations that the film had, and was seen by many people as a failure in that regard. That being said, it's weird to take box office data as an indicator for Best Picture, but a seeming failure can also sour the film in the eyes of voters. If the Academy wanted something that was the typical Oscar film, they could have nominated our next film, The Ides of March, a George Clooney-directed political thriller starring him and Ryan Gosling, which got a PGA nomination and also a Golden Globe nomination, also scoring an Oscar nomination for screenplay. While it had all those things going for it, the momentum for this film had basically slowed. It only getting a screenplay nomination may not have helped it. That being said, a lot of critics also did not see this film getting a Best Picture nomination. A film that did get a Best Picture nomination this year, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, was an even bigger surprise. And a lot of people would have seen The Ides of March as a more likely Best Picture nominated film than that. Another film this year that had strong Best Picture buzz, even if it was unconventional, was Bridesmaids. The outrageous female-led comedy, starring and written by Kristen Wiig, got a PGA nomination, a Golden Globe nomination, and a SAG Cast nomination. Also scoring Oscar nominations for supporting actress Melissa McCarthy and for screenplay. This one seemed to have plenty of momentum going into award season, which is especially surprising considering the Academy usually doesn't award comedies in this kind of category, and it had a lot more precursors than people were expecting. That being said, I feel like it would have been a bigger stretch for the Academy to award a madcap comedy like Bridesmaids than it would have been to award a genre film like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Not saying it's impossible, it just seems like a bigger hurdle that it might not have been able to overcome. Next 2 films I had more outside chances, but definitely got buzz. Drive got a BAFTA and Critics' Choice nomination, and also got a nomination for sound. Critics absolutely loved this film, and there was some momentum building for it. But I feel like the momentum just wasn't strong enough for it to get a Best Picture nomination, considering that it only got a sound nomination when it may have been expecting some acting nominations as well. And the final film I have for 2011 is Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. That got a lot of buzz in the UK as it is a British film, where it got a BAFTA nomination. And for the Oscars, it got actor, screenplay, and score. While there was some buzz for this film to get a Best Picture nomination, I just have a feeling it wouldn't have been enough. I don't know if Gary Oldman's performance was enough to pull it into the Best Picture race. However, that is something similar that we would see a few years later with his performance in Darkest Hour propelling it to the Best Picture category. Even still, I just don't see it moving up in that Best Picture category. So with that, I think my pick for the 10th film in 2011 would have been The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I just think the case against it is a lot weaker than the other films, considering David Fincher's momentum coming off The Social Network, and especially considering it won the Oscar for Best Editing. I just think in a field of 10, it would have made the cut. For 2012, the films I have shortlisted are The Master, Moonrise Kingdom, and Skyfall. In the case of The Master, its really only precursor was it got a Critics' Choice nomination for Best Picture, but at the Oscars, it got 3 acting nominations. That's no small feat. However, it was also somewhat of a polarizing film, with some critics saying it was the best movie of the year, and a lot of critics just not liking it. So you could say that the polarizing nature of the film and its lack of precursors may be working against it here. On the other hand, Moonrise Kingdom has a few more precursors. While it has Critics' Choice, it also has a PGA nomination and a Golden Globe nomination, and its only Oscar nomination was for screenplay. But unlike The Master, it was much more of a crowd pleaser. I don't really have a good argument for Moonrise Kingdom not getting a Best Picture nomination. I guess in hindsight, you could say it was a little early for a Wes Anderson film to get a Best Picture nomination, considering the fact that he would make The Grand Budapest Hotel a couple years later, but I don't think that's a good enough reason to keep it out of the Best Picture race. Looking at Skyfall, it got a PGA nomination, and it got 5 Oscar nominations, all of which were in music and technical categories. It too was a crowd pleaser, and was seen as one of the better films from its franchise in a long time. But as we know, the Academy and big franchises don't always get along. I know that being part of a big franchise shouldn't be a reason not to nominate something. However, I just think it being a big franchise, especially considering the fact that it was snubbed for acting nominations for Judi Dench and Javier Bardem, I just wonder if the momentum really would have been there at the end. So for 2012, I would predict that Moonrise Kingdom would have gotten that final nomination. I just think of it as the logical next man up in this race. For 2013, the films I shortlisted are Inside Llewyn Davis, Blue Jasmine, Saving Mr. Banks, and The Butler. Starting with Inside Llewyn Davis, this is a film that should have been a shoo-in on paper to get a nomination, but it missed most of the precursors, only getting a Golden Globe nom and 2 Tech noms at the Oscars. Even though it's a star-studded Coen Brothers film, it's a relatively quiet film, and it's not very showy. There may not have been enough here to propel this film above others in the minds of voters. The next film is Blue Jasmine, which scored PGA and Critics' Choice nominations on the strength of its cast and writing. Cate Blanchett's performance did much of the heavy lifting here in terms of its momentum. It's conceivable that Blanchett's performance could have propelled Blue Jasmine into the Best Picture category, considering that this arguably happened the same year with Matthew McConaughey and Dallas Buyers Club. Even with that, I'm just not sure that the same strategy would have worked twice in the same year. Moving on to Saving Mr. Banks. This is a film that had a lot going for it early on, and then the momentum just slowed for this film. Seeing as Hollywood loves films about themselves, a movie about the creation of Mary Poppins with Tom Hanks as Walt Disney should have been a lock. And while the film did score PGA and Critics' Choice nominations, Emma Thompson was surprisingly snubbed on Oscar morning, and the film only got a nomination for its score. Even then, a film like this could have been well liked enough among Academy members to nab that final spot. The last film I want to talk about here is The Butler. Talk about a star-studded cast. Its SAG Ensemble nomination proved that some voters could have elevated it for its cast alone. But considering its lukewarm reviews and the fact that it got no other Oscar nominations, I don't see this one sneaking in. So, my pick for the 10th film in 2013 is Saving Mr. Banks. I know it got some surprising snubs from the Oscars and it was barely nominated, but this scenario is very similar to the same one that happened to Selma a year later. A surprising acting snub and no love anywhere except for the music, but Selma got that Best Picture nomination. In a field of 10, I think this film would have snuck in to capture the final spot. For 2014, this is the first year that the Best Picture category is only 8 films, instead of the usual 9 of the previous few years. The films I have shortlisted for this year are Foxcatcher, Gone Girl, Unbroken, and Nightcrawler. Foxcatcher probably has the best argument on paper for its inclusion in this category because of the fact that it got a Best Director nomination, making it the first film since the Best Picture category expanded to get a Best Director nom while the film itself did not get a picture nom. It also got Oscar nominations for 2 of its actors and a screenplay nomination, not to mention that it also scored a PGA nom. It didn't receive as much buzz as some other films this year, but considering the other nominations it received, the case for its inclusion may be too strong to leave them out. Moving on to Gone Girl, this is David Fincher's second film that's been on the bubble in this video, and it might have a stronger case than his last one. Gone Girl received just about all the precursors it could have, and a strong Best Actress nomination for Rosamund Pike. The film had more buzz around it than Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, and it was more successful. While Best Actress was the only nomination it received, I don't think that does much to hurt Gone Girl's chances here. Unbroken is a film that had a lot of buzz early on, with it being an inspiring biopic directed by Angelina Jolie. While it got a Critics' Choice nomination and 3 tech noms at the Oscars, its momentum came to a screeching halt when audiences saw it. I think the mixed reviews it got were enough to keep it out of the race. And finally, Nightcrawler. I personally love this film for how stylish and creepy it is, and it got PGA and Critics' Choice nominations. Despite all the buzz for Jake Gyllenhaal's performance, it only scored an Oscar nomination for screenplay. This just screams a film that flies under the Academy's radar. Despite how many people would have loved and wanted to see this film nominated, I'm worried that the film itself might have scared off voters. My picks to round out the field in 2014 are Foxcatcher and Gone Girl. These are the 2 films that had the right pieces and the momentum where I can easily see them getting into an expanded field. Now on to 2015. There were once again only 8 nominees for Best Picture. The films I shortlisted for the final 2 spots are Carol, Straight Outta Compton, Star Wars The Force Awakens, Sicario, and Inside Out. Starting with Carol, this is a film with one of the most impressive resumes that didn't end up getting nominated for Best Picture. It got nominations from BAFTA, the Golden Globes, and Critics' Choice, and it was revered by critics as one of the best films of the year. And it also received 6 nominations on Oscar morning, including noms for both its actresses, its screenplay, and its costumes. Carol was the most nominated film since the Best Picture category expanded not to receive a Best Picture nomination. On top of that, it seemed to be a near consensus among predictors at the time that Carol was going to get nominated for Best Picture. So what happened? It's hard to say, but one has to wonder if its LGBTQ themes played a part in the film getting snubbed. The only other gay romance to get nominated up to this point was Brokeback Mountain, and that film was just too big to ignore in 2005. Considering some voters may have just ignored a film like this, I could see that as a reason that it might have slipped down the ballot. But in an expanded field, I have a hard time seeing Carol miss out. On to Straight Outta Compton. This was one of the most talked about films of the year. It got PGA and SAG nominations, and it was loved by critics and audiences alike. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this isn't your typical Oscar biopic, and I'm not all that surprised that it didn't get nominated. Though, part of me thinks its screenplay nomination was sort of a consolation prize. That being said, films like this is what that 10th spot is for. I can definitely see a world where this gets in. Speaking of talked about films, no movie was more talked about this year than Star Wars The Force Awakens. Audiences and critics both rallied around what was the most highly anticipated film in a decade. While the Academy doesn't typically award big blockbusters, this was around the time that attitudes seemed to be shifting toward the Academy awarding audience favorites. It scored 5 tech nominations, and I don't think it's out of the question that it could have snuck into Best Picture. These last 2 I'll talk about quickly. Sicario is a gritty crime drama that scored a PGA nom and was loved by critics. While it scored some tech noms, I think it sneaking into Best Picture would have been too big of a long shot. Inside Out was another film with a lot of buzz this year, with many calling it Pixar's best film in a decade. It's always worth talking about when an animated film gets a screenplay nom, and I don't think the fact that it's a family film would have hurt it too much. However, I do think the field was just too crowded this year for Inside Out to break in. My two picks for 2015 are Carol and Straight Outta Compton. Carol was an easy choice. It would have and should have been in there. As for Straight Outta Compton, I think it had stronger precursors and more awards momentum than Star Wars The Force Awakens. For 2016, we're back to 9 films. The films I shortlisted for the final spot are Silence, Loving, Deadpool, and Jackie. I'm not gonna lie, this is a year where I think a field of 9 was probably alright, and whatever the 10th film is would seem like a bonus entry. That being said, there are still some great movies that could have made it. Starting with Silence. This was Martin Scorsese's passion project about Catholic missionaries in Japan. But uncharacteristic of a Scorsese film, there was relatively little buzz behind it. It wasn't nominated for any precursors, and its only Oscar nomination was for cinematography. However, I think the fact that it's a Scorsese film may have been enough to put it over the top in a relatively weak field. The next film I want to talk about here is Loving. This was a quiet historical indie darling that was lauded by critics for its strong acting performances and its heart. Loving got a Critics' Choice nomination for Picture and a lone Oscar nomination for Best Actress for Ruth Negga, which was seen as somewhat of a surprise. As much goodwill as this film had, it does seem unlikely that a film that scored its only nomination as a surprise would also nab a Best Picture nomination. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's just not too likely. Now, the most interesting film on this list is Deadpool. If the Academy wanted to kill two birds with one stone, it could have nominated this to recognize both an outrageous comedy and a superhero film. As I've said, the Academy was moving in the direction of recognizing blockbusters, but I do think Deadpool was just a little too out there for voters, considering that it got no nominations, and I just have a hard time seeing this sneak in. However, it did get a PGA nomination, so maybe it's not so crazy. And probably the most conventional pick I have here is Jackie. Jackie is a biopic that Academy voters eat up, and Natalie Portman's performance was carrying most of the weight here. While it didn't get any precursors, Natalie Portman got a Best Actress nomination, and the film got 2 other noms. While its momentum wasn't too strong, none of these films had that much momentum anyway. If we're looking at a typical Oscar pick, this might be the one. No film really seems like a good answer here, but if the Academy is going to pick the film with the most general appeal that ruffles the least amount of feathers, I think it would probably be Jackie. It's something I could certainly see the Academy nominating. Jackie is my pick to round out the 10 in 2016. For 2017, the films I shortlisted for the 10th slot are The Florida Project, I, Tonya, Mudbound, The Big Sick, and Blade Runner 2049. The Florida Project was Sean Baker's breakthrough film that made him known outside of just indie audiences. Propelled by Willem Dafoe's strong supporting performance, the film was adored by critics and got a Critics' Choice nomination. However, the film being what it is may have put it at a disadvantage, with it being a slice-of-life film that's not too flashy. Also, most of A24's resources were being diverted to Lady Bird's Oscar campaign. Even though their lone nomination for supporting actor was a strong one, I could see the argument for either this film making it in or this film being left out. I, Tonya isn't exactly your typical biopic, but it's conventional and intriguing enough where I could see it piquing the Academy's interest. It got a PGA nomination and 2 powerhouse nominations for Margot Robbie and Allison Janney. Not to mention, it also got a coveted Best Editing nomination at the Oscars. The film's momentum was picking up as The Florida Project was slowing down. I can easily see I, Tonya sneaking in to nab that final spot. Another film that had a shot this year was Mudbound, a relatively quiet Netflix film. Its lack of precursors could be balanced out by its nominations for Mary J. Blige and for its screenplay. As silly as it sounds now, it being a Netflix film may have hurt its chances, seeing as the Academy wasn't quite in love with the streaming giant joining the party. The Big Sick was among the most surprising films of this award season. A lovable rom-com that audience and critics couldn't get enough of. It got all the right precursors, and it somewhat surprisingly beat out The Post for a screenplay nomination. But would the Academy have really recognized a rom-com like this? Considering 2017 was a year full of unconventional Oscar films, it's certainly possible. The final film I have here is Blade Runner 2049. Now, this is an absolute long shot to make that 10th spot, but seeing all the love it got in the tech categories, I think it's worth considering. A sequel to a decades-old classic, films like this have been recognized in this category before and since. But without any precursors, maybe it's just not the right time for the Academy to honor a film like this. My pick for the final spot in 2017 is I, Tonya. It was close, but I just think it had more momentum over the Florida Project and The Big Sick. For 2018, we're back to 8 films. The films I have shortlisted for these 2 spots are If Beale Street Could Talk, First Man, A Quiet Place, and Crazy Rich Asians. If Beale Street Could Talk had so much going for it. Barry Jenkins' first film since Moonlight was universally loved by critics, and Regina King's performance got a lot of buzz. It didn't get many of the early precursors, but it scored a supporting actress nomination at the Oscars, as well as noms for screenplay and score. This was a pretty shocking snub at the time, with a lot of people scratching their heads as to why it was left out. I think that's hard to say, but maybe it's because its momentum slowed down, or maybe it's because Annapurna, the film studio, was also pushing Vice to be a Best Picture nominee. Whatever the reason, it should have been nominated, and I can easily see it getting in an expanded field. Next up is First Man, and this is another film that was a follow-up for an up-and-coming director that had slowed momentum. Damien Chazelle's follow-up to La La Land had so much early buzz behind it, both for the story it was telling and for Ryan Gosling's performance. But as the season went on, enthusiasm for this film completely fell off. Its only Oscar nomination was for visual effects, which it ended up winning. Even though this film fell into the background, I could still see a possibility of this one sneaking in, considering it's largely inoffensive and a pretty typical Oscar choice. Moving on to A Quiet Place. This is a more unconventional pick. A surprise horror blockbuster from a well-known first-timer, this film had a whole lot of goodwill behind it, and it scored a PGA nomination. In 2018, there is precedent for a fan-favorite horror film to ride a surge of enthusiasm into the Best Picture race. Look at Get Out from the previous year. But A Quiet Place's momentum wasn't as strong as Get Out's. Considering that it only got a nomination for sound, I have a hard time seeing it break into the field. The final film I have here is Crazy Rich Asians. This was an audience favorite that came out of nowhere. A very well-loved rom-com. Audiences love the cast, the locations, the humor, and the heart of this film. It scored nominations for PGA, the Golden Globes, and SAG Ensemble. It's not out of the question for a comedy like this to get nominated, but for this to get nominated for picture and nowhere else, that would be pretty strange. On the other hand, considering there weren't many performances to be singled out and screenplay was so competitive this year, I could see the Academy showing it some love here. So, my 2 picks for 2018 are If Beale Street Could Talk and Crazy Rich Asians. Beale Street was an easy pick. Crazy Rich Asians, hear me out on. Even though this would have been the only nomination it received at the Oscars, the film's momentum was so great that I could see it going against all convention and getting in. For 2019, it's back up to 9. The films I have here are Knives Out, The Two Popes, and Uncut Gems. I'll be quick with this one. It's Knives Out. This was a popular whodunit comedy with a star-studded cast, and it got a PGA nomination, as well as an Oscar nomination for screenplay. It's overall a comedy, but I don't see that hurting its chances too bad. In a field of 10, I have a hard time seeing a scenario where Knives Out is not that 10th film. Looking at The Two Popes, this got a lot of buzz for its performances. With 2 acting nominations and a screenplay nom, it has a strong package if it were to get into picture. But it's basically a filmed conversation. With the other competition this year, I just don't see it getting in. And finally, Uncut Gems. This is a film that had a late surge of momentum at the end, particularly for Adam Sandler to get a nomination for Best Actor. But it was pretty polarizing with audiences, and seeing as Adam Sandler didn't get nominated, it might have just been below the Academy's radar. My pick for the 10th film in 2019 is Knives Out. And now, we're finally at the last year of this, 2020. A weird year with plenty of weird happenings in the Best Picture category. The field went back down to 8 this year. The films I shortlisted here are One Night in Miami, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, Da 5 Bloods, and Borat's subsequent movie film. Starting with One Night in Miami. Just about everyone expected this to be nominated. It was adored by critics and got every precursor it possibly could have gotten. And while it got nominated at the Oscars for supporting actor, screenplay, and song, it was snubbed for picture and for a widely expected Best Director nomination for Regina King. Really, the only thing I can think to blame this on is late momentum from films that did get nominated, like The Father and Sound of Metal. In a field of 10, it would have easily made it. Everything I just said about One Night in Miami is especially true for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. It had about as much goodwill as you could get, with the buzz surrounding Viola Davis's performance and Chadwick Boseman's posthumous performance, which did a lot to drive the film's momentum. On Oscar morning, it got its expected nominations, just not for Best Picture. And again, you could blame this on the late surge from other films. You can also blame it on Netflix focusing its resources on other films, and maybe hoping Chadwick Boseman alone would get this film in the Best Picture field. It didn't, but it should have. Da 5 Bloods was Spike Lee's follow-up to BlacKkKlansman, and was well liked by critics, but more mixed with audiences. This is a film that just got lost in the shuffle of this year. While it also had a posthumous Chadwick Boseman performance to boost it, it only got a nomination for its score. I just don't see it making the field. And finally, we have Borat's subsequent movie film, the surprise sequel to Borat that surprised everybody. Maria Bakalova's supporting performance was one of the biggest things that people were talking about in this movie. She got an Oscar nomination and so did the screenplay. Calling this an unorthodox Oscar film would be an understatement. In any other year, it would be too weird to consider, but this wasn't any other year. This film getting a PGA nomination is a testament to that. With that said, I do think it gets edged out by the other films here. My picks for the final two spots in 2020 are One Night in Miami and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. It seems natural to me that these two would have made it into a field of 10. In 2021, the Academy finally decided to set the Best Picture category to 10 films, putting an end to the fluctuating number of films every year. Even though it's fixed at 10, that doesn't mean that films still don't get snubbed, and it doesn't always mean every deserving film gets nominated. But I do think having it fixed at 10 films does a better job at representing the year in film as a whole, making room for films that wouldn't otherwise get recognized, which was supposed to be the whole point of the expanded category in the first place. Well, that and Retribution for The Dark Knight. Thanks for watching.